It was the worst blizzard the San Juan Mountains of southern Colorado had seen in 30 years. The pass closed and the whole county whited out at 9,000 feet. The night a Navy SEAL pulled two deputies out of the snow, Luke Brennan was home in the county he'd grown up in, between the Navy and whatever came next, and he had only been out on the pass road at all because his dog would not let him stay home. Gunnar had come off the truck seat rigid an hour before, a Belgian Malinois in the prime of his life who had walked point in worse places than this, and he had faced the storm through the windshield and would not stop pulling towards something out in the white. When Luke finally found it, his headlights caught a sheriff's department truck nosed off the road and half buried in a drift, and two men down in the snow beside it, and one look told him this was no accident. Somebody had run these men off the pass and left them out here to freeze. What happened in the next hour, and the last thing a dying old lawman pressed into Luke Brennan's hand, would finally drag a 40-year-old lie out into the open in that frozen county. Stay with me to the end of this one. And if you're new to this channel, go ahead and subscribe now because this is the kind of story we tell, and you'll want to be here for what comes next. To understand why Luke Brennan trusted a dog over his own good sense and drove out into a killing storm, you have to understand the wound he had brought home from the Navy. He had given the teams the best years he had, and he had lost men the way men in that work do. But the loss that never healed was not the kind you can put on a stone. It was the operation that went wrong because of a decision made by someone safe and warm and 4,000 miles away. A man with clean boots who would never have to look a mother in the eye. Who signed off on a thing that got good men killed and then went home to dinner? Luke had carried two of his brothers out that day and had not been able to carry the third. And the thing that had eaten at him in all the years since was not the enemy who pulled the trigger, but the comfortable man who had left them out there to die and never lost a night's sleep over it. He had come home to these mountains to figure out what a man like him was for now, and he had not figured it out yet. He had a truck and a dog and his grandfather's empty cabin and a quiet that asked him questions he couldn't answer. The dog had come home with him. Gunnar was 4 years out of a war and still sound, dark and fast and serious, a working dog who had never learned how to be a pet and had never wanted to. He slept by the door instead of the fire and watched Luke the way he had once watched a tree line, and on the bad nights he would press his shoulder against Luke's leg and stay there until the man's breathing came back down. He was not a soft dog and he was not a friendly one. Exactly. But he had a code as strict as any Marine's. He did not quit a scent. He did not abide a thing being wrong in his world without doing something about it. Luke had stopped questioning that nose a long time ago, in places where questioning it would have gotten people killed. And so when Gunnar stood rigid at the window that night and faced the storm, every hair along his spine up, Luke did not tell himself it was the wind. He put on his coat. Have you ever known someone who refused year after year to give up on the truth? A person everyone else had written off as stubborn or foolish, who turned out to be the only one who was right? If you have, tell me about them in the comments below. I read every one. The ones who don't quit are exactly who this channel is for. The older of the two men in the snow was Hank Dolan, and Luke knew him the way you know the men who shaped a place you grew up in. Hank had carried a deputy's badge in that county for 40 years, since he came home from the army a young man and pinned it on, and he had been the deputy who drove drunk teenagers home, instead of jailing them, and the one who sat with widows, and the one every kid in the county was a little afraid of and a lot fond of. He was 64 now and weeks from retirement, and he had one thing he had never been able to let go of, one case that had ridden in the truck with him for 4 decades. In the spring of 1986, a 22-year-old named Calvin Reese had vanished off the face of that county, and the official word had always been that the boy ran off, the way young men sometimes did. Hank Dolan had been a rookie that year, and he had never once believed it, and for 40 years, quietly on his own time, he had kept working it, kept a notebook, kept asking questions, kept his eye on the one man in the county powerful enough to make a thing like that go away. The younger man was Ben Cordell, and Ben was 25 and 3 weeks into being a father, with a baby girl named Lily at home and a wife who had not wanted him working that night. He had been riding with Hank because that was how you learned from the old man before the old man hung it up. And when Luke Brennan reached the two of them in the drift, he understood the worst of it at once. The thing that will break you, the thing he would never be able to unsee. Hank Dolan had given the boy his coat, The old deputy lay in the snow in his shirt sleeves, having stripped off his own coat and wrapped it around the unconscious rookie, and pulled the kid against him to share what heat his old body had left. And he had been lying out there in shirt sleeves, in a 30-below wind chill for the better part of an hour, dying by inches so that a 25-year-old with a 3-week-old daughter would have a few more minutes. Gunner reached him first and lay down full against the old man's chest the way he'd been trained to buy minutes, and Luke dropped to his knees in the snow. If you had found 2 men left to die in that snow, and then who had been getting away with it for 40 years, could you have trusted the law to handle it, or would you have made sure the truth came out yourself? Be honest with yourself. Type LALE or truth in the comments below. I read every one. Luke worked fast, the way he'd been trained, and he got the rookie breathing steady and bundled and dragged toward the truck, but Hank Dolan was too far gone and the old man knew it. There is a calm that comes over the dying when the cold has them, and Hank had it. He was past shivering, past pain, and his eyes were clear. With the last of what he had, Hank caught Luke's wrist and pressed something into his hand, a thick, worn notebook, rubber-banded and swollen with 40 years of being carried, the cover gone soft as cloth. He made Luke take it, closed both his failing hands around Luke's to be sure of it, and in a voice that was barely a voice anymore, the old deputy said 3 things. He said the boy's name, Calvin Reese. He said his second name, the name of the man who had run them off the road, and the man who had made a 22-year-old disappear in 1986, and it was a name that ran the bank and the cattle and half the county. And then Hank Dolan, who had spent 40 years refusing to leave one lost boy behind, looked at the unconscious rookie wrapped in his coat and asked Luke Brennan to finish it, and to look after the kid, and to tell the boy it wasn't his fault. He said one more thing, almost too quiet to hear, something about a place set at a table, and then he closed his eyes with the dog's heartbeat against his chest, and the snow came down on the both of them. And he was gone before the ambulance could have ever reached that pass, even if the pass had been open. The old man had given away his coat. That was the kind of lawman he was, all the way to the end. And Luke Brennan knelt in the drift beside a stranger he'd known his whole life, and did the only thing left to do, which was to make a promise to a dead man and mean it. The name Hank gasped out was Cyrus Hargrove, and in that county, the name was practically the same as the word for ground. Hargrove owned the bank and the biggest spread and a seat on every board worth having, and his family had, as the saying went, built the place. He was in his 70s now, white-haired and respected, the man whose name was on the hospital wing in the high school gym, and the notion that he had run a sheriff's truck off a pass and left 2 deputies to freeze was the kind of thing that, said out loud in that county, would get you laughed out of the room, which was exactly the protection Cyrus Hargrove had been counting on for 40 years. Luke sat up that whole first night with the rookie stabilized in a hospital bed and the old man's notebook open on his knees, and what he read in Hank Dolan's careful, decades-long hand made the betrayal he carried from his own war rise up in him cold and clear. He saw the lie and the truth at the same time. The lie was that Calvin Reese had run off and that Hank and Ben had died in a weather accident on a closed pass. The truth was in the notebook, built one patient page at a time over 40 years, and the last few pages dated in the last month were the break Hank had finally gotten, the thing that had gotten him killed. An old ranch hand of Hargrove's, dying himself, had finally told Hank where Calvin Reese was buried, on Hargrove land, under a stock tank that had been dug in the summer of 1986. There was a clock running, and Luke understood it the moment the county coroner, a man who banked at Hargrove's bank, began moving to rule Hank and Ben's wreck a simple weather accident. No runoff, no second vehicle, just 2 unlucky lawmen and a bad night. Once that ruling was signed, the notebook became the ravings of a stubborn old deputy, and the stock tank stayed a stock tank, and Cyrus Hargrove stayed the man whose name was on the gym. So Luke did not take it to the local sheriff's office, where half the wages were paid one way or another by Hargrove money. He drove 4 hours through the cleared pass to the state police, and he laid Hank Dolan's 40 years on a state investigator's desk, and then he went to see an old woman he had heard about his whole life without ever really seeing. Esther Reese was 88 years old, and she was Calvin's mother, and for 40 years she had been poor Esther, the woman who couldn't accept that her boy had run off, who kept his room exactly as it was, who was pitied at church and humored at the diner and quietly considered a little broken by grief. Luke sat in her front room, In a house that had a young man's high school pennant still pinned to a bedroom door down the hall and a photograph of a smiling boy in a frame that had been dusted 10,000 times, and he told her, as gently as a man can tell such a thing, that her boy had not run off, that he had never left her, that he had been 40 years on the Hargrove place the whole time, a half-mile from a mother who never stopped waiting. And Esther Reese did not weep the way he had braced for. She sat very straight in her chair, and her old hands folded in her lap, and she looked at Luke Brennan with 40 years of vindication and grief in her face, and she told him quietly that she had known. Mothers know, she said. The whole town had decided she was a fool for it, and she had let them, because being a fool who believed her boy was better than being a sensible woman who gave up on him. Then she asked Luke just one thing, whether her Calvin had suffered, and Luke, who had learned somewhere along the way that there is a mercy more important than the precise truth, told her that it had been quick, and held the old woman's hand while she finally let herself cry the tears she had been saving for 40 years. The reckoning came 3 days later, when the state investigators went out to the Hargrove Ranch with a warrant and a backhoe, and the whole county, which had laughed at the idea, came out to the fence line to watch in a silence that got heavier by the hour. Cyrus Hargrove came down from the big house in a wool coat, white-haired and certain, and he did the thing his kind always do. He was warm, and he was reasonable, and he was outraged on behalf of the law, and he spoke about his family's name and his decades of giving and the absurdity of it all, and his lawyers stood at his shoulder. There were witnesses everywhere now. State troopers, the recovered rookie Ben Cordell on his feet against doctor's orders, half the town along the fence, and Esther Reese, who had asked Luke to bring her, standing small and straight in a black coat, when Hargrove's old fixer, a man named Del Stroud, made a sudden move toward the investigators at the tank. Gunner came off Luke's side low and silent, and put himself between the man and the people behind him, a single unbroken sound coming up out of him, and Del Stroud went very still and did not move again. And into that stillness, the old woman in the black coat spoke, looking not at the backhoe but straight at Cyrus Hargrove. I never stopped setting his place. No one moved. Even the dog did not move. 40 years she had set a place at her table for a son everyone told her had abandoned her, and she said it not as an accusation but as a simple fact. And it filled that frozen pasture so completely that there was no room left for Cyrus Hargrove's reasonable voice. He understood that the whole county had heard it, and that the whole county believed her now, and the certainty went out of his face the way it goes out of a man who has finally, after 40 years, been seen. Then Luke Brennan spoke, and his voice was low and level, the voice of a man who had learned in hard places that the truest authority never has to be raised. He did not shout, and he did not lay a hand on the old man. He simply laid it out, in order, in front of the troopers and the town. Hank Dolan's 40 years of patient work, the dying ranch hand's confession, the date the stock tank was dug, the runoff marks the local coroner had been so eager to ignore, the paint from a Hargrove truck the state lab had already matched to a dead deputy's door. He told the county what Cyrus Hargrove had done to a 22-year-old in 1986, and what he had done to 2 lawmen on a pass 3 nights ago to keep it buried. And he told it the way you finish a mission a better man could not finish himself. And as he spoke, the backhoe operator at the tank raised a hand, and the digging stopped, and a state trooper took off his hat, and everyone along that fence line understood that Esther Reese's boy had just come home. Cyrus Hargrove was reading no more speeches. He looked at the old woman, and at the hole in his own pasture, and at the dog watching him, and a powerful man who had owned the county for half a century put his hands behind his back without being asked. What happened over the following weeks? Moved through that mountain county the slow, certain way the truth moves, in high places, in the diner and the feed store and the little stone church on the square. Cyrus Hargrove went away to answer for both of his crimes. The 140 years old, and the name on the gym came down. Calvin Reese was finally laid to rest in the town cemetery beside the father he'd never gotten to grow old near, and the whole county that had pitied his mother for 40 years came to the funeral and stood with their hats off, ashamed of every easy thing they'd ever said about poor Esther. And Esther Reese stood at her son's grave with her chin up and was not poor anything anymore. And Hank Dolan was buried with full honors. A 40-year deputy and an Army veteran who had given a young father his coat in a blizzard, and the sheriff's department named the closed case file after him, and grown men who had been driven home drunk by Hank Dolan 30 years ago, wept openly at the back of the church. Ben Cordell, who would carry a deputy's badge for the next 40 years because of the man who gave him his coat, stood at the front in his dress uniform and could not get through the eulogy. And in the end, he did not have to. The whole department stood up with him and finished it together, the way you carry a brother the last few steps. There are turns in a life that feel less like coincidence than like arrangement. That a dog who would not stay home drove a lost seal out into the one storm where a dying old lawman needed someone to finish what he'd started. A man does not have to know the word for that to feel it settle in his chest. And Luke Brennan stopped wondering what he was for. He had come home carrying the memory of men left to die by a comfortable man who never paid for it. And he had been given, in the worst storm in 30 years, the chance to make sure that this time the comfortable man paid, and that the men who were left behind were carried all the way home. He went to see Ben Cordell, who was alive because an old man gave away his coat, and he held the 3-week-old girl named Lily who would grow up knowing exactly what Hank Dolan had done. And somewhere in the holding of her, he set down a weight he had carried for years. He did not leave the county after that. There was an empty deputy's position and an old notebook full of other people's unfinished business in a town that needed someone who didn't quit. And Gunnar needed a job as much as Luke did. On most mornings now, there is a sheriff's truck on the pass road with a Belgian Malinois in the passenger seat, driven by a man who learned from a dead deputy what the badge is actually for, which is to be the one who goes out into the storm when no one else can, and to never, ever leave anyone out there to die. What happened in that blizzard was not extraordinary in the way we usually mean the word. An old man gave a young one his coat. A dog refused to stay home. A seal kept a dying stranger's promise. And a mother who had set a place at her table for 40 years finally got to bring her boy home. It will break you, maybe. But somewhere underneath the breaking, there is the other thing. The thing this whole frozen county learned that winter, that the truth does not stay buried forever. Not as long as there is one stubborn soul left alive who refuses to stop digging for it. This story is for every person who never gave up on the truth, no matter how many winters it cost them. And for everyone who has ever given their coat to someone who needed it more. Is there someone in your life who refused to quit on the truth or who gave away their coat in the cold for somebody else? Put their name in the comments below. Let's fill this section with the stubborn ones and the selfless ones, and leave it there for people to find. Every story on this channel is about the ones who go out into the storm when no one else will. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more of these stories to tell. And before you go, which moment in this one stayed with you the most? I'll see you in the comments.